we have at least 10, 12 minutes to raise question to the speaker. Please, you want to say something? Please, if you.
Thank you. Wonderful opening. Thank you so much. So I'm really curious about your experience in 2018 and where that takes you going forward. Are you planning to meet people where they are, exercise this kind of empathy and compassion that you describe as more effective in future conferences and other interactions? Could you describe how those lessons learned will be integrated into the work you're doing and the work that you encourage others to do?
Thank you. After that, I had anticipated, and I've now written a new book called How to Talk to a Science Denier, where I went out on the road to put this into practice. I'd been studying science denial for 15 years from my office. It's a very different thing to go out and meet them face to face, because I've never actually met a science denier. They think of themselves as skeptics and more scientific than the scientists, and actually tried to convert me when I was there, but it didn't work. So I've been out speaking with other science deniers on different topics. All the while COVID was creeping up, and that very much interfered with the research for my book, because my goal after the Bache and Schmid study came out, it was clear we can talk to science deniers and sometimes change their mind. And of course, as a philosopher, I wanted to push it to the next level and say, well, what about hardcore deniers? And this research was done online. Could we do it face to face? It's very difficult to have a face-to-face conversation with the COVID denier during a pandemic. So I could not do that. So it did limit my research, but I did the best that I could. Took some of it online, spoke to some friends where I couldn't meet strangers. And I guess the thing that I learned the most was this: science denial is not just about doubt, it's about distrust. They don't have an information deficit, they have a trust deficit. And the best way to overcome distrust is face-to-face conversation. There's something about the humanity of meeting someone face to face. And I never would have known this if I hadn't gone to the Flat Earth Convention. It was a searing experience. It was uncomfortable, but I also learned that I could have very productive conversations with people about whom I disagreed with, very basic scientific fact. I went out with one of the guest speakers who had just run a seminar on how to convert people into Flat Earth. I took him to dinner and we spoke for 2 hours. So we really did try to find as much common ground as we could have, and I think felt some of the walls of distrust come down. But I also learned that it is a very difficult thing to convert someone. It's probably the hardest venue you could imagine, 650 flat earthers and me. But so maybe it's no surprise that no one tore off their lanyard and walked out and said, what a fool I've been. But I do think that I made some progress simply by showing up to speak. If COVID hadn't happened, I wish I'd had more opportunity. My next, once COVID is done, I want to get back out there.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Monsieur Sorondo, please.
So I really want to ask something that is a little radical, but anyway, do you think that this decline of the truth in the media, almost in the media, I don't know in the universities, but maybe also, have some relation with the atheism of massive atheism that is promoted by the mainstream, the pensée unique, as say Pope Francis sometimes.
I'm sorry, I have a bit of a hearing problem. I didn't hear the last part of the question.
The last question is, this decline of the truth, especially in media, have some relation with the atheism. Atheism, you know what is atheism?
Atheism.
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 No God. No God.
Yes.
Yes. That is promoted by the mainstream. Pensée unique, that say Pope Francis. We have the dictatorship of the mainstream. That is pensée unique, that the strong force in the world are against to religion. We don't quote it more religion. No.
Right.
Any government asked God nothing after the pandemic, the COVID, this kind of things. So,
Please.
I'll say this. It has seemed to me that the media has a difficult task because at least in part, it's motivated by economic forces. And the competition for eyeballs, competition for attention has led to a bit of a race to the bottom, sometimes just due to lack of resources through the inability to vet things as they used to. So I think that's probably the main driving force. But you're bringing up an important point, which is, are there other cultural or ideological forces behind this? And I'm not sure I'm ready to lay it at the feet of atheism or humanism or any particular view like that. But I will say this: it's always seemed to me that reporting is at its best, the media is at its best, when it's questioning, when it's has respect for the idea that it doesn't always know the truth. I see I guess as a philosopher, I've always enjoyed Socrates' idea that the biggest impediment to truth is not ignorance, it's false belief. When we think that we know the answer, we're much less inclined to engage in inquiry. I have to say that sort of hubris can come from many sources. It sometimes comes from politics. It comes from ideologies of various stripes. It can also come from atheism. It can come from universities, different places. I think that the most important thing, I think that the model for this type of inquiry that we're talking about is scientific inquiry, where ideally it's supposed to be one where we're always willing to change our mind on the basis of new evidence. As I said, science is not Euclidean geometry. I wrote a book a while back called The Scientific Attitude, where I made the argument that what was really distinctive about science, and one could argue other things as well, is that they care about evidence and they're open to changing their mind on the basis of new evidence. I think that's very important. People can go astray in that for various reasons because they think that they already know the answer and they don't need any more evidence. I believe that that can happen no matter what one's ideology.
Thank you. Justin and then Marcelo, please.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Lee. To your point about these one-on-one conversations to build trust, to find common ground. And this is a question that I think we'll return to almost in every panel, but how do we do that on a larger scale beyond building trust with, people that we meet at a conference or maybe around a family around a dinner table or something like that? What sorts of strategies are there to employ that would do that on a societal level, or at least in pockets?
It's hard because I gave a talk on Posttruth one time to a head of a corporation, and his first question was, is this solution scalable? Which I had to laugh because the corporate speak word, is it scalable? And I thought, it's really not. But if you have enough people doing it, it can make a difference. One of the things that's been the most depressing in the United States right now, to me, as I watch our politics, is that we're not speaking to one another anymore. We can disagree about many things. Americans have always disagreed about values. But when we stop talking to one another, then I think the problem gets worse. And then we start to disagree about facts, which can't happen. That's a real problem. So I think it would be enough if we did just start talking to family and friends who we disagreed with. I know many people who have cut off family and friends. They no longer see them. They no longer speak with them because they're on the other side of the political divide. I don't think that should happen. So as I've written this new book, I've pushed people, call the cousin who is an anti-vaxxer. You might have more in common than you think. Be respectful, listen. That was another thing I learned at the Flat Earth Convention, that you have to listen to people. Even if you disagree, if you listen to anybody for about 10 minutes, they'll eventually say, don't you think I'm right? Or what do you think? There's your opportunity. So as long as it's conducted in humane way, I think we can have these conversations with anybody. And I've got friends who are brave, who go out and have these conversations with folks across the political divide when they're as outnumbered as I was at the Flat Earth Convention.
Please, Marcelo, and then we have
Thank
the
you.
last
Thank-
three, 1, 2, 3.
Lee, thank you so much for such an exquisite reflection and your larger body of scholarship. The question I have is more pertinent to the perfect storm that gathers when essentially the teaching of science, especially in our country, has remained really catastrophically below par.
Yes.
We are now, I was just looking at the PISA data. I remember Andrea Schleicher was in this room presenting the OECD PISA data. Our students are now about 30 countries do better than the United States in math and science. I wonder, how do you see that general nexus between our falling farther and farther behind, the undertow that the teaching of science and the understanding of science is creating seems to be ever more dangerous. There's a wonderful documentary, I can't remember the title now, where something like a third of Harvard faculty couldn't really explain what Galileo was doing, I don't know, 300 yards from here. So I wonder if you could talk about the relationship between science and the problems of teaching science in our country and this larger domain that is the topic of your research.
Thank you for the question. Teaching science better, that is not just teaching science appreciation, but teaching how scientists reason, that uncertainty is not to be feared, that science makes mistakes, that you can learn from failure. I think these lessons should be taught to elementary school students. I remember in my own science education in elementary school, we were made to feel that weren't we lucky to be born into the era in which all truth had actually been discovered. And then, of course, find out later, no, would have been much better to teach us how to think like scientists. And I think also to teach philosophy. I think there needs to be more philosophy taught early on. I taught logic to fifth graders one time, and they were ready. They were as ready as my college freshmen to do that. But I think it's important to remember that we cannot simply educate our way out of this problem. I have a good friend, Andy Norman, who just wrote a book called Mental Immunity, based on some work that Professor Lewandowski and Professor Cook has done on the idea of immunizing us to bad thinking. That one of the best things we can do in our education is to get us ready for the fact that we're going to be fed bad information later on. Part of post-truth is that disinformation tactics, the intentional creation of propaganda to make us believe false things, hit a virgin population, a population that was not prepared with the right kind of philosophy and science education to push back against it. So yes, what you're saying is important. Better science education would help us to inoculate ourselves. But I think another piece of it that I haven't even talked about yet, some things that I'm working on now, is what to do about the problem of disinformation. Because I think that we fool ourselves if we think that science denial or post-truth is simply based on mistakes, on misinformation.
Yeah.
Science denial is not an accident, it's a lie. Someone intentionally creates disinformation because it serves their interest to try to get us to believe it. And any sort of inoculation in our education to try to get us able to push back against that, I think is a very good thing.
Yeah. Thank you. Please. Yes, we have to watch the time. Eh?
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. Thanks, Lee, for the talk. Yeah, I mean, you sort of made two conflicting points, I think.
Okay.
On the one hand, you're saying, as you just said 30 seconds ago, that there is some infrastructure in place that is disseminating disinformation and that science denial is no accident. And I totally agree, of course. I think, that's absolutely crucial. And I would go further than that. I would say that there's an infrastructure, not just for science denial, but also for polarization that emerges out of the architecture of our online information environments at the moment. Algorithms that we know are polarizing people. So yes, we have to take that on if we want to make a difference.
Yes.
But at the same time, you're also saying it's really important to talk to our neighbors and friends. And yeah, I think that's also true. But to me, there's a tension there. And I worry a little that by saying, oh, we just got to be nice to each other, talk to our friends, we're walking away from the elephant in the room, which is the
Great
sort
question.
of infrastructure we have to take.
Thank you for
Thank
this,
you.
for this question. This is a wonderful question. I think that it's both, not either or. I think that there are three problems. One is the creation of disinformation. The other is the amplification of disinformation on social media and partisan media. And the third is the uptake of that disinformation in the population once it's too late. There's just something about the cognitive bias in the human brain that a certain percentage of people, when they're presented with this information, are going to believe it. So my book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, is what to do once people are already infected, what to do once it's too late. They've already been exposed to the disinformation. That doesn't mean that the solution is simply to go out and talk to people. It means that that's what we do when the virus has spread, when it's too late. It's already in the population. I also believe that we need to do more to recognize that we're actually in an information war, that post-truth is the result of again, it's not an accident, it's a lie. Someone has created this for their own purpose, and that we need to recognize that in order to fight it, and that we also need to do something about amplification. Without amplification, this would go nowhere. I remember reading a story the other day that something like 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people. 12 people can't do much damage unless they have social media, and then they can do a lot of damage.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I suppose I want to come back to that idea of the infrastructure. So I'm wondering, when you were talking to those flat earthers, did you get a sense of, where they found that community, who was funding it, who is the big tobacco of flat earth?
Yeah.
And, where's the kind of diagram of where this is coming from? And is the amplification they got it from, was that from social platforms?
I have never been able to figure it out. I think that I sort of understand where the cigarette denial and climate change denial came from. I think I more or less understand anti-vax and the other ones, evolution denial. They seem to, you can trace it back. I've never been able to really figure out the source for flat Earth. It's a conundrum. No one seems to be making much money on it. They did have some folks who were doing homegrown research. There was one fellow who funded his own rocket that went up 1,800 feet. And I met him and I got to see the rocket. He since died. He died the following year in an accident in that rocket. He could have gone up that many feet by going up in a tall building. I don't know what he expected to find. Some did have the experimental attitude. That one, I've never really been able to figure out who's the author, who's behind it. I'll have to go back.
Thank you. Ana Marta, and then we are ready for your presentation. Please.
Thank you, Lee, for your very clarifying talk. Well, my question has to do with something you said about that science denial is not so much about reason, but about identity.
Yes.
Yes, and that's really interesting. It reminds me of Arlie Hochschild's book on strangers in their own land, where she exactly Arlie Hochschild's book on strangers in their own land. She made exactly that point. But the interesting thing here is that she mentioned that people once they are imbued in this identity politics, so to speak. They are not so open to rational discourse, even if you try to show them what's in their best interest. Even interests are no longer relevant. The only relevant thing is the emotional dimension. Because so I think that's precisely the most distinctive element in the post-truth society, the fact that the emotions, once they are, once people think that this issue is touching their identity, there is no room for reason anymore.
This is an important point. Michael Lynch's work, Know-It-All Society, was the thing that really cemented for me that science denial was about the question of identity. This is why it's so hard to convince them, because you're not just challenging what they believe, you're challenging who they are. And that's a harder thing. Jonathan Swift said it best: you can't reason someone out of something they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. That's why facts alone don't work. That's why you need to work on trust. I'm buoyed by the fact that this has worked, though. If we had more time, but I've also written in various places about the fact that there are hardcore science deniers who have changed their beliefs, which meant changing their identity on the basis of these sorts of conversations about climate change, about vaccines, about other topics. So it is possible to do, but it does show the importance, to come back to Stephen's point, of doing something about the disinformation before it gets to them. Because once the infection gets to them, it is very, very hard to get them over it. Though one must always remember that science denial exists on a spectrum. Not everyone is a hardcore denier who's been marinating in disinformation for 10 years. Some of them are simply scared, and they're confused. They don't know what to believe because they're hearing so much information from different sources, and they don't know who to trust. And the community of people that they turn to are not necessarily folks who know either. So that's a difficult problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.